Peter Hudis for delivering his lecture for us. I should start by introducing Peter. Peter has been working on the Marxist ideas in relationship to the themes of race and ethnicity, has been working on critical theory, and he has been a chief editor for the complete works of Rosa Luxemburg, as far as I know, and he was the author of Raya Dunayevskaya Reader. Raya Dunayevskaya being one of the major thinkers in humanist Marxist tradition. Personally, to me, she is known quite well for her pretty original interpretation of the Soviet type of socioeconomic formation. And then recently we have got a book about Frantz Fanon, authored by Peter as well. And very recently in the Jacobin, there was an interesting article introducing this book. So today's lecture is going to deal with the issue of racialized capitalism. What the recent protests against racial injustice in the United States and elsewhere tell us about the racial inequality inbuilt in the construction of modern capitalist world system, and what Marxists should learn, how they should proceed with making their struggle in a way more conscious, more inclusive of the issues of racial justice. Thank you very much for joining us, Peter, and floor is yours now for around, say, 45, 50 minutes. And then I envision lots of questions.
I hope so. I'm looking forward to the discussion. So thank you very much, Vladimir and Songjan, for this invitation for a very important subject, which also is related and comes out of my work, my earlier book, Marx's Concept of the Alternative to Capitalism. I think both the questions of race and alternatives to capitalism and alternatives to racism are interconnected. I'll begin by saying that the standpoints that have largely defined debates around race and class are being seriously challenged by the historical turning point that was reached with the massive protests against police abuse and for Black lives following the murder of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020 in the USA. This represented the largest continuous series of protests in US history, with 26 million people participating in rallies and marches in 2,400 different towns and cities across the United States. And this movement continues today in a series of ongoing campaigns aimed at defunding police, aiding workers impacted by the ravages of the pandemic, and abolishing prisons and the criminal injustice system. And I should mention that I'm not only theoretically interested in this subject, but I'm also actively involved in the Chicago Defund Police campaign, which is a project sponsored by the Black Abolition Network. So it's both a theoretical and a practical imperative, this issue for myself at least. What was new about these protests, I should mention, is not just the size, but their form. Inspired and often led, of course, by Blacks, Latinos, and Native Americans, these protests were multiracial and provided a forum for a variety of voices: women speaking out against sexual discrimination, immigrants opposing deportation, frontline workers deploring the lack of protection from COVID, transsexuals opposing sexual violence, etc. And an unprecedented level of mutual aid arose and was integral to these protests, creating vital bonds with disenfranchised communities, especially in the south side of Chicago, for instance, where there's a great many poor, permanently unemployed people who joined in these actions. But most of all, these protests reshaped political discourse in the United States in a number of directions, but especially by bringing long suppressed demands for police and prison abolition to the forefront of public debate. Now, of course, none of this arose out of thin air. It was preceded by a decade of protests against judicial murders of Blacks, from Trayvon Martin in 2012, straight onward to Breonna Taylor in 2020, as well as years of work by a new generation of very young, articulate activists calling for the abolition of the criminal justice system in the United States, often in the face of indifference or opposition from traditional leftists and liberals, let alone, of course, from the right wing. New labor organizing during the pandemic also played a part in this upsurge, strikes by bus drivers in Detroit, Amazon workers in Staten Island, meat packers in Iowa and South Dakota, as well as other labor protests that broke out around the world in response to the inequities exposed by the pandemic. But it took a response to the brutalities of racism to bring unprecedented numbers of people onto the streets, not just in the United States, but worldwide. Now, the key point I want to make here is that racism is the Achilles heel of American society. Insofar as class relations in the US have been structured along racial lines since its inception. Hence, revolts against racist humanization have historically served as a catalyst for challenging its dominant social formations. And this is being reconfirmed today. The struggle for Black lives has not detracted from class struggle, it's enhanced it by bringing into view the visage of a multiracial working class movement. Now this, I think, renders rather out of date the claim of many Marxists that race-based politics detracts from the class struggle or the fight against capitalism. And indeed, many activists in today's anti-racist protests make no secret of their hostility to capitalism, and they certainly identify as part of the working class. Yet it's not the general class struggle that motivates them, as much as capitalism's thoroughly racialized nature. And I think that also renders rather out of date, increasingly, versions of identity politics that push issues of class or anti-capitalism aside, which continues, of course, to dominate left-wing academic discourse in the United States. So I think in sum, the tendency to view race and class as mutually independent variables is increasingly anachronistic. Historical turning points like the one experienced today have a way of casting judgment, not just upon existing society, but also upon those claiming to oppose it. And so that's what I want to focus on here. Now, I'm not suggesting that anything that's happened in the last year constitutes a durable anti-capitalist movement, let alone one that coalesces around the viable conception of an alternative to capitalism. But you know, the same could be said of the Marxist and radical left, which has been around for far longer. The resurgence of interest in socialism over the last decade is most promising, but it has largely defined itself by calling for an equitable redistribution of value, a demand that, in principle, if not always in practice, is compatible with the continuance of the capitalist mode of production. In fact, it's hard to find a leading figure in the socialist left, in the English-speaking world at least today, which does not define socialism as the fair redistribution of surplus value. Now, that's completely understandable, given the extreme inequities that characterize contemporary society, which, of course, became all the more pronounced during the pandemic. But it still falls short of a Marxian critique of capital, which calls into question not merely the unequal distribution of the products of labor, but the alienating conditions of life and work that makes it possible. Now, recently, Martin Haglund, a Norwegian philosopher, has written a very interesting book, This Life, which I encourage people to look at, in which he makes the following argument. He says, and I quote, "It makes no sense," I'm quoting Haglund, "to argue that the problem is capitalism and at the same time argue that the solution is the redistribution of capital wealth. The form of the argument is a contradiction in terms. It asserts the problem of capitalism and that the solution is capitalism, in which capitalism is tacitly defined as neoliberalism and redistribution is tacitly defined as an alternative to capitalism. What's missing are not indictments of capitalism today, but a rigorous definition and analysis of capitalism, as well as the principles for an economic form of life beyond capitalism," end quote. Now, it's hard to see how an anti-capitalist perspective, whoever advances it, can make headway in addressing the lived experience of people of color if it fails to target the reified forms of human praxis that defines contemporary society. A redistribution of value would surely benefit Blacks, Latinos, Native Americans especially, who suffer capitalism's worst inequities, but it does not in and of itself challenge racist attitudes and behaviors. There's no assurance that targeting the ills of a market economy based on private ownership of the means of production translates into challenging and overcoming racialized ways of seeing and relating to others, especially since those who imbibe the norms of a racist society very often include so-called progressive whites. The outstanding post-colonial theorist, Sylvia Wynter, I think consider her one of the greatest minds, frankly, the second half of the 20th century for enormously influential work in many areas, spoke to this situation about 5 years ago when she wrote the following. I want to quote Wynter. It's a little long quote, but it's needed. She said the following: Both before and during the post-World War II global anti-colonial and anti-apartheid uprisings, Marx's prophetic, poetic, emancipatory project had been, for so long, the only ecumenically human emancipatory project around. The result was that many of us thought that what first had to be transformed was, above all, our present free market, free trade mode of capitalist economic production system into a new socialist mode of production. The idea was that once this was done, everything else would follow, including our still ongoing status-ordered, hierarchically structured world systemic order of domination, subordination, and racism. This change was to automatically follow. Of course, it didn't happen, end quote. Now, she makes a compelling point. If capitalism is defined in terms of private ownership, unfettered Marxist, and freely contracted wage labor, it follows that socialism or communism is defined by nationalized property, central planning, and the abolition of labor markets. This was famously expressed, by the way, in the Erfurt program of 1891, which established the template for both reformist and revolutionary Marxists that followed, including the Russian Marxists, including Mensheviks and Bolsheviks. Their 1903 program stated as follows, and I'll quote that. It said of Russian Marxists, by replacing private with public ownership of the means of production and exchange, by introducing planned organization in the public process of production, the social revolution of the proletariat will abolish the division of society into classes and thus emancipate all oppressed humanity, and will terminate all forms of exploitation of one part of society by another. Well, guess what? Didn't happen either. Now, it can be argued that it's unrealistic to expect those living prior to Stalinism to recognize that ending private ownership of the means of production provides no assurance for the abolition of either class domination or racism. That shouldn't have been the case, however, in the post-World War II era, when many of Marx's writings, which addressed this problematic, had been pried from the archives. Marx, as we know, held that the theory of the communists may be summed up in a single sentence: abolition of private property. But he said this not because he privileged the collective over the individual, but because abolishing private ownership of the means of production is the precondition for the free association of the producer. Bourgeois property right is the immediate target of critique, since short of its annulment, workers cannot obtain control of the labor process. However, a change in property forms that leaves alienated labor intact leads not to a new society, but to another variant of capitalism. Marx himself prophetically attacked, his words, the crude and unthinking communists of his day on the grounds, as he put it, quote, for them, the community is only a community of labor and equality of wages paid out by communal capital, by the community as the universal capitalist, end quote. This identification of the community as a universal or abstract capitalist, his phrase, following the elimination of individual capitalists, is a remarkable anticipation of 20th century social democracy and Stalinism, as well as of non-status cooperatives that do not thoroughly transform alienated labor. As Marx put it in the same piece in the 1844 manuscripts, the relationship of the worker to labor, he stated, creates the relation of it to the capitalist, or whatever else one chooses to call the master of labor. Private property is therefore the result, the product, the necessary consequence of alienated labor, of the external relation of the workers to nature and himself. Hence, here's me now speaking, not Marx, I was quoting him. Private property in the sense of class property, of a class that owns the means of production instead of the working class, continues so long as power over individuals exists, whether or not property takes a social or collective form. Which is why Marx argued in Capital that the forms of social capital, in contrast to private capital, in which capital of directly associated individuals prevails as opposed to private ones, constitutes the abolition of capitalist private property within the confines of the capitalist mode of production. Now, what holds for property forms likewise holds for the free market. Marx, of course, opposes the free market, not because he fetishized rational planning, but because its condition of possibility is a peculiar form of social labor. Concrete products of labor can be universally exchanged only if they contain a commensurate substance that is itself not concrete. This is not supplied by labor in general, but by a specific kind of labor, abstract labor. Abstract labor is a substance of value, which takes the form of appearance of exchange value in money. Abstract or homogeneous labor is therefore human labor power expended without regard to its form of expenditure. It involves individual acts of laboring being subjected to a universal time determination, regardless of the laborer's concrete or particular qualities. As Marx writes in chapter 1 of Capital, quote, the same labor, therefore, performed to the same length of time, always yields the same amount of value, independently of any variations in productivity, end quote. The value of commodities is therefore not determined by the hours of labor employed in making them, but by the average amount of time in which it's necessary to do so. An average that varies constantly as technological innovations allow more to be produced in less time. A process that constantly goes on behind the backs of the producers. Hence, what grounds and makes possible the so-called free market is therefore the despotic plan of capital, which subjects individuals to a time determination over which they have no control. The annulment of market anarchy leads to a new society only if freely associated relations are established inside and outside the workplace, in which the tyranny of an external time determinant is annulled and time instead becomes, Marx's phrase as well, time becomes the space for human development. All too many Marxists, however, give insufficient attention to this crucial role and importance of abstract universal labor time in Marx's theory of capital, largely because they treat abstract labor as a transhistorical characteristic of any labor process. For example, Tikhonov Oakton defines abstract labor as labor, I'm quoting him, labor abstracted from the various concrete forms of being and expenditure of labor power. Abstraction, in his use of the term here, refers to extracting a specific aspect or aspects within one's thought. Now, we call this in philosophy reasoned abstraction, insofar as it involves a mentally deduced average that need not reflect any corresponding material reality, just as I can deduce the average weight of a group of people without any one of them having that actual weight. This is not, however, what Marx means by abstract labor. It is a real abstraction imposed upon the producers by the relentless pressure of socially necessary labor time. This relentless pressure to produce in accordance with an abstract average outside of the producer's control did not exist before capitalism, and it surely will not exist after it is abolished. Oakton is therefore quite wrong when he states, and I quote him, abstract labor is a characteristic that actual labor in every sort of society possesses in common. It is something common to the labor of every form of society, end quote. How can abstract labor characterize the social form of labor in every form of society in the absence of a world market that forcefully imposes the law of value upon unwilling producers? Now, this isn't a scholastic debate. The assumption that abstract labor defines every form of society renders invisible the specific form and texture of the human relations that make possible the capitalist mode of production. When the domination of abstract over concrete, when the domination of abstract over concrete labor is viewed as a transhistorical fact of the human condition, the domination of dead labor over living labor likewise becomes viewed as an unalterable fact of human existence. After all, the substance of value, of which capital or dead labor is the material embodiment, is abstract labor. The tendency to naturalize abstract labor, common among some of the most sophisticated Marxists, renders invisible the fundamental contradiction of modern life, the transformation of human relations between people into objectified relations between things. Now, my argument here is that this shortness of vision has especially negative implications when it comes to integrating anti-racist perspectives into Marxism, precisely because racism is the ultimate expression of treating people as objects, as mere things. If the abolition of our present free market, free trade mode of capitalist economic production is a necessary but insufficient condition for uprooting class domination and ensuring a free association of the producers, why presume that once this was done, everything else would follow, Winter's words, such as the eradication of racism? Why assume that the abolition of class domination will lead to the end of racism if the former is understood in terms of the abolition of property forms and market relations? Can anyone seriously argue in this day and age that collectivized property and rationally organized exchange do anything to undermine racism? The over-hasty assumption that the abolition of private ownership of the means of production by itself makes room for annulling forms of domination not reducible to class, such as racism and sexism, makes sense only from the standpoint of a vulgar Marxism that equates the transformation of modes of production to changes in historically contingent property and exchange relations. Yet there is absolutely no historical evidence, and much to the contrary, that doing so does much of anything to reverse the racism that has defined capitalism since its origins in the 16th century. Now, what I want to say speaks to this problem is a point that David Harvey makes in his otherwise valuable book on imperialism. So I want to quote Harvey, what he says here. He says, quote, Marx's theory of capital accumulation is constructed under certain initial premise assumptions that broadly match those of classical political economy. These assumptions, he says, are freely functioning competitive markets with institutional arrangements of private property, juridical individualism, freedom of contract, and appropriate structures of law and governance guaranteed by a facilitative state, which also secures the integrity of money as a store of value and as a medium of circulation, end quote. Now, Harvey is here actually describing the surface phenomenal features of capitalism that define some of its historical phases. However, such phenomenal features of a given historical stage is not the same as the essential logical determinations governing it at every stage. Conflating the historical with the logical leads to a serious misunderstanding, both of Marx and the revolutionary project. Freely functioning competitive markets do not define many capitalist societies, which have long been characterized by a significant role of the state in the economy, and institutional arrangements of private property have often been violated in pursuit of capital accumulation. We're seeing this in the United States today, by the way. Moreover, it is hard to see how appropriate structures of law and governance and freedom of contract can account for the brutality of slavery and contemporary anti-Black racism, both of which have long been integral to capitalism. If we were to take Harvey's historical description for the logic of capital, we would have to conclude that Marx's work has little to offer those opposing the violent inhumanity of racialized capitalism that treats Black lives as completely expendable. Now, Harvey himself, I think, is aware of this, which is why he builds on Rosa Luxemburg's Accumulation of Capital to argue that capital is accumulated not just by exploiting free wage labor, but also through persistent violent dispossession of those living in non-capitalist strata. The problem, however, is that he essentially equates accumulation by dispossession with privatization. This can hardly account, however, for forms of racial domination in which the state plays a critical role, such as through publicly funded prison industrial complex, government engineered housing policies which provide disproportionate benefits to white property owners, state-sanctioned predatory lending that imposes onerous debt burdens on Blacks and Latinos, etc. Nor can it account for the most outstanding instantiation of the so-called primitive accumulation of capital of the 20th century, the Soviet Union's forced industrialization, which achieved in less than 20 years what it took Western imperialism 200 years, the forced uprooting of tens of millions of peasants from the land, and their transformation into industrial wage laborers. It's surely no accident that this brutal process, which took the lives of millions of people, of course, was termed by the regime primitive socialist accumulation, probably the ugliest term that ever entered the lexicon of Marxism. Now, the tendency, virtually unquestionable in many circles, to target market anarchy and privatization as the problem robs Marxists of the ability to address forms of dehumanization that are not reducible to either one. Neoliberalism denotes a particular manifestation of capitalism. Opposing it does not lead to targeting capital itself. Those who fail to grasp this cannot help us understand what revolution is and why it is needed. Now, the difficulties faced by many Marxists in providing an adequate account of the integrality of racism and capitalism, I think, is a major reason while many critical race and post-colonial theorists have turned away from Marxism in favor of alternative approaches, none of which, in my view, point us towards any alternative to capitalism. Yet those of us committed to that project of an alternative to capitalism need to put aside our defensiveness in the face of such criticisms and acknowledge that part of the reason for the attraction of identity politics is that post-Marx Marxism has largely relied upon a set of theoretical and practical assumptions that are proved incapable of accounting for the persistence of anti-Black racism or the lived experience of those combating it. It's surely not an accident or incidental that we have Marxist theories of the state, of politics, of finance, of culture, of media, even of art, but we still don't have a strictly Marxian theory of racialization. Why not? If it's the case, as Ellen Wood once argued, I'm quoting her, that gender and racial equality are not in principle incompatible with capitalism, it follows that there is no reason to develop a Marxist theory of racialization at all. All that would be needed is to support the efforts of minorities to secure bourgeois democratic rights within the framework of existing society, while reserving one's energies for the really crucial battle of taking on capital through proletarian revolution. But what if a successful proletarian revolution that points the way to an actual transcendence of capitalism requires much more than a transformation of property relations? What if it requires more than replacing the free market with social planning? What if surmounting the value form of mediation requires transforming the very fabric of human praxis that defines this historical era? And is the latter even possible, so long as ingrained racism persists, not only before but after a revolution? Is there not a massive price to be paid if it turns out that a successful transformation of capitalism, something that has not been achieved thus far, depends on a fundamental uprooting of the ways in which racism and sexism do not just reflect, but generate reified social relations? In this sense, they are determinations of reflection in a Hegelian sense, which are active and not just passive. Raya Dunevskaya, founder of Marxist humanism in the US, spoke to this in responding to the transformation of the Russian Revolution of 1917 into a state capitalist society under Stalin as the successes, when she wrote, "It is not the means of production that create the new type of humanity, but the new type of humanity that will create the new means of production," end quote. So given the profound crisis facing Marxism, not only in general, but in making itself relevant to the social movements of today, I think that we have to rethink the assumptions that have guided the theoretical and practical approaches of post-Marx Marxism. Developing a viable vision of an alternative to capitalism has never been more important than now, and may well depend upon it. So for the remainder of my talk, I therefore want to focus on one particular issue, because this is a broad subject, of course, one particular issue that is repeatedly raised by those involved in these anti-racist struggles, and that is the contention that Blacks have been written out of the social contract that grounds and defines modern society. Now, we all know that contractual relations are integral to capitalism, because wage labor is a contractual relation. It takes the form of appearance of a contract. In wage labor, mutual recognition takes place insofar as each party agrees to formally acknowledge the claims of the other. Of course, such recognition is very limited and superficial, since capitalists extend recognition to workers only insofar as they augment profit, and workers recognize their boss only insofar as they continue to employ them. But the seemingly contractual nature of wage labor is dispelled once we leave the market and enter the hidden abode of production, where the despotic plan of capital reigns supreme. Now, what defines this despotic plan is a domination of dead over living labor. It intensifies with each new stage of capital reproduction. When viewed from this standpoint, we discover that the laborer, as Marx puts it, in Capital is no free agent at all. The domination of the dead over the living does not free capital of the need for labor power, which can only be provided by living laborers. Yet as the law of value relentlessly, imposes its will by forcing ever more value in ever shorter amounts of time from the backs of workers, relatively fewer of them remain gainfully employed in productive labor, while many are cast into so-called unproductive labor and permanent unemployment. From capital's standpoint, their lives no longer matter. Now, critics who claim that Marx's theory of capital cannot account for the social death experienced by those subjected to unfree conditions of racist domination tend to overlook the despotism that defines the apparently free wage labor relation. But in all fairness, many Marxists have left the door open to such criticisms by arguing that chattel slavery and other despotic societal formations are incompatible with capitalism. This claim undermines the theory of bureaucratic collectivism, for instance, developed by a number of Marxist theoreticians such as Max Shachtman, Bruno Rizzi in the 1940s to account for the class nature of the Soviet Union. Its proponents argued that the Soviet Union could not be state capitalist since it abolished private property while subjecting large sectors of the workforce to outright slave labor. The suppression of free in favor of slave labor was taken to mean that the USSR was a unique formation unanticipated by Marx that was neither capitalist nor socialist. Now, to be sure, there is no capital without wage labor, and no wage labor without capital. A society exclusively defined by slave labor is not and cannot be capitalist. However, Nothing prevents slave labor, especially in its racialized forms, from augmenting capital in a society whose general creative basis is wage labor. Roman slavery could neither create nor augment capital because the conditions of generalized wage labor did not exist. American slavery could and did augment capital, since it operated in the context of a capitalist world market in which wage labor generally prevailed. The same goes for racialized forms of violent social control that followed the end of chattel slavery, like Jim Crow. Marx was very clear in this school. I want to quote what he stated in Theories of Surplus Value. He wrote, referring to the Americas, in the second type of colonies, plantations, where commercial speculations figure from the start and production is intended for the world market, the capitalist mode of production exists, although only in a formal sense, since the slavery of Negroes precludes free wage labor, which is the basis of capitalist production. But the business in which slaves are used is conducted by capitalists. The method of production which they introduce has not arisen out of slavery, but is grafted onto it. In this case, the same person is capitalist and landowner, and the elemental existence of the land confronting capital and labor does not offer any resistance to capital investment, hence none to the competition between capitals, end quote. That's Marx. So even if we were to put aside what Marx wrote on chattel slavery and successive forms of racial domination, there is nothing in his theory of capital that excludes consideration of the social death experienced by those left out of the social contract. Now, taking it a step further, the ramifications of Marx's critique of wage labor become highlighted when read alongside Hegel's discussion of the social contract in his Phenomenology of Spirit. Catherine Malibu emphasizes the following, namely, that the social contract in Hegel expresses the necessity of the total surrender of each person with all of his or her rights to the entire community. The language that allows this to be formulated is by the same token alienated, forced to speak another language, that of the exchange contract. Hegel shows that the contracts bearing on property are the prototypes of political contracts, not the other way around. Contract theorists take as their model the relationship between men and things, or between things themselves, not the relationship of men among themselves. Now, for Hegel, through contract, as he puts it, the universal becomes united with existence in general. That is, by formally externalizing ourselves in relation to others, we establish ourselves as social beings. We become acknowledged as persons insofar as we enter into and uphold a contract. Those left out of it are not considered real persons at all. Hegel goes on to show that what binds the individual to the social contract is confession. Confession. Confession is, he writes, nothing private, secluded from the political sphere. On the contrary, Hegel says, confession is a political achievement. Confession is the post-contractual expression of the will. That is, we confess because we are ill at ease. What prompts our ill ease or unrest is the alienation that is endemic to modern life. As Malibu puts it, quote, in modern society, the individual does not recognize itself in the community that it is nevertheless supposed to have wanted. She is non-recognized by her own recognition. She is outside herself in an alien spirit. The individual is alienated from itself, end quote. Confession is the way to resolve this contradiction by asking forgiveness for having transgressed one or another part of the contract. But what happens if you're not part of the contract to begin with? More specifically, what happens when race enters the picture, which is not taken up by Hegel? To make contract, you have to acknowledge, at least on some level, that the other is a person. But what happens when whites see blacks, not as persons, but as things? This reification is the essence of racism. Racism blocks recognition even on the juridical level. The personhood, the humanity of the individual is not seen at all, which makes it easy for racist police to kill blacks, Latinos, and Native Americans with abandon. Now, in a psychiatric paper that has recently become available, the great philosopher Frantz Fanon noted that victims of racism often refrain from confessing criminal liability to the police, even when they are clearly guilty of the crimes they're charged with. This is because, he says, confession depends upon a contractual relation, which is missing in a colonial context. As he puts it, I confess as a man and I am sincere. I also confess as a citizen and I validate the social contract. But if you're not viewed as a person, you have no stake in the contract. There can be no reintegration if there has not been integration to begin with. Fanon devoted much of his life work to exploring the ramifications of denying colonized subjects the possibility of social integration. Experiencing this lack is very painful and gives rise to all sorts of anxiety and neuroses, one of which is an inferiority complex, expressed by the colonized trying to become white in order to obtain recognition by their oppressors. However, the effort to overcome racial exclusion, he shows, contains within itself a different possibility, that of tarrying with the negativity inherent in being victimized by racism by reaching for a total of rooting that leads to what Fanon calls a new humanism. Since victims of racism have weaker ties to juridical relations, they have potential to go beyond calls for a fair redistribution of the products of labor by questioning the dehumanized character of life itself, something that does not necessarily arise from the general class struggle. Blacks experience humanization in its starkest form and therefore have left of a stake in its continuance. In this spirit, Fanon addressed himself to the wretched of the earth who truly have nothing to lose but their chains. Now, this may not have the ear of class first reductionists today who hold that race-based politics distracts from rather than deepens the class struggle. However, I would argue that one reason such standpoints are out of sync with the present moment is that they are insufficiently Marxist, insofar as they fail to grasp how the logic of capital is restructuring contemporary class relations. And in this way, here's my argument to conclude. Clearly, the relentless pressure of socially necessary labor time is reducing the proportion of living to dead labor as never before. This does not make the working class superfluous, since expanded reproduction depends not just on the production, but also the realization of surplus value. A whole host of new occupations open up to ensure the latter, from information technology to service work, etc. At the same time, whole arenas of the economy, teachers and government workers, for instance, are becoming increasingly proletarianized. There's a long history of debates within Marxism concerning this supplanting of living by dead labor as heralding the possible end of capitalism. Theorists from Herbert Marcuse to Tony Negri, and including Moshe Postone to contemporary accelerationists, have argued that this process will liberate society from work and make possible a post-capitalist future in which free time rather than labor time serves as the measure of social relations. For many, the self-development of the object, dead labor, rather than that of the subject, the class struggle against capital, is the active agent in social transformation. Such techno-optimism, however, comes into question when an issue that almost all these above figures I mentioned ignore is brought to bear in the debate, the racialized nature of capital accumulation. One person who did recognize this was Huey Newton of the Black Panther Party back in 1970, when he stated the following, quote, "Technology is developing at such a rapid pace," in 1970 he says this, "that automation will progress to cybernation, and cybernation probably to technocracy. If revolution does not occur soon, the proletarian working class will definitely be on the decline because they will be unemployables. Every worker is now in jeopardy." End quote. Now, Newton was intimately aware that this had already greatly impacted Black labor, which felt the impact of deindustrialization long before that term gained notoriety. Like George Jackson, he well knew that the replacement of living labor by dead labor was not liberating Blacks, but instead forcing them to even more despotic conditions in the hellholes of America's prisons, which were beginning their explosive growth in the US exactly in the period in which the Panthers were being victimized, in the late 1960s. He understood that every worker will now be in jeopardy, given the militarized forms of repression bound to be used against an increasingly disenfranchised populace. As Jackie Wong notes in a very important recent book, Carceral Capitalism, Newton and other Black Panthers, as she puts it, draw attention to the possibility that labor-saving technologies will not necessarily liberate humans from work as we move towards a post-scarcity and post-work society, but can lead to the creation of surplus populations that are housed and generate value in prison or are folded into the economy as debtors. A racial lens that is brought to bear on the logic of capital undermines the claims of the subjectless, post-humanist techno-determinism that has become popular in much of the left today. While claims that capitalism will abolish labor have long been specious, capital will clearly continue to displace workers. The pandemic is accelerating this. So what are its ultimate consequences? Surely not the annulment of the law of value, which is driving the process. Surely not the collapse of capitalism due to overinvestment in technology. Dead labor cannot serve as the emancipatory alternative. Only live human beings can uproot a system based on abstract forms of domination. But what forces might they be, and do they have the potential to overcome this relentless march of capital to self-destruction? Fanon too addresses this in a fascinating way in one of his last psychiatric writings, in which he explores the difference between the relaxed attitude towards time on the part of North Africans versus the objectified sense of time that prevails in the West. He writes as follows, quote, this is Fanon: being a good worker means you have no trouble with the time clock. The worker's relations with the apparatus are strict timed. For the worker, being on time means being at peace with the time clock. The moral notion of guilt is introduced here. The time clock prevents and limits the endemic guilt of the worker. For the boss, the time clock is indispensable. As the time clock is continually present, it introduces a number of specific conducts into the worker. It represents the overall apparatus that employs the worker. Before the time clock, the worker had the possibility to apologize or confess. But from now on, the worker is constantly rejected in the solitude with the impossibility of persuading the employer about his good faith. Now, listen, folks, this is it's so incredible point he's making here. The worker felt guilt and apologized, she confessed, for not keeping pace with the time clock. Guilt arises from broken contract, from a debt that remains to be paid. As a wage laborer, the worker is part of the social contract, but it still confronts her as an alien spirit. She tries to transcend the sense of alienation by confessing to not keeping pace with the clock. But what sets the pace of the clock? Not the boss, not even the company. The clock is set according to the dictates of value production, the drive to conform to the socially necessary labor time that it takes to produce a commodity on the world market. No matter who you are, worker or capitalist, the law of value confronts us as a person apart, as an alien spirit in Hegel's terms. As a result, the effort to achieve reconciliation with the political community breaks down, just as the quest for recognition in the section on self-consciousness in Hegel's phenomenology breaks down. And it does so because capitalism is governed by an abstract form of domination, abstract universal labor time that can hear no apology. There can be no recognition between a person and an impersonal time determination that actually employs them and controls them. The more abstract capital's dominance becomes, as all aspects of work in everyday life is compelled to conform to socially necessary labor time, the harder it is to achieve even the pretense of form of recognition. In a word, the logic of capital is ultimately undermines its contractual form of appearance. I believe we are living in an era defined by this phenomenon. It has serious consequences for class politics and identity politics. No longer can workers obtain even the pretense of recognition on the basis of their job, career, or place of employment, which constantly shifts as labor becomes less secure and more precarious. Moreover, today's concentration and centralization of capital is producing not a compact and unified working class, but rather a highly differentiated and variegated one, employed or unemployed in multiple venues. Atomization and isolation become ever more ingrained, producing a deep sense of loss and anxiety in the body politic. One expression of that being the rise of anti-Black racism in the form of white identitarian politics. But at the same time, many who experience the increasingly precarious and unstable conditions of contemporary capitalism, but who are not invested in blaming other oppressed people for their distress, tend to become energized by anti-racist struggles. As recognition based on class relations is undermined, it is only to be expected that it will be sought, recognition will be sought in other sources, such as race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, etc. As capitalism deprives recognition to those who once received it on a minimal level, many become moved to identify with those to whom recognition has long been denied on any level. This is especially seen in the large numbers of white youth who are galvanized for the first time into political activism by the Black Lives Matter protests of the past year. Battles over race, gender, and sexuality increasingly serve as the catalyst for bringing a differentiated and dispersed working class onto the streets. We may be witnessing something like this today with the emergence of new kinds of multiracial working class struggles, but working class struggles that define themselves in relationship to the color line rather than abstracting from it or ignoring its central importance. With that, I'm looking forward to hearing what you all have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It was extremely interesting, educative, and thought-provoking. So now the floor is open for debates. I think we have two ways two ways of raising questions here. Either you can use the raise the hand icon, raise a hand function on your Zoom icons, and you raise your electronic hand. I notice you get the floor, and then you orally ask your question. Another way of asking question is, please write down your question in the chat window. Then I recite it for Peter and we get the answer. So either you raise your electronic hand or you write in the chat window, please. So the floor is open for debates now. Any questions, suggestions, ideas? Anybody wishing to ask any questions? Okay, and then maybe I should begin. Well, it's a partly question, partly suggestion. It was very interesting to listen to your talk, and especially this idea was so provocative that in classical Marxism, in the corpus of works of classical Marxism, there is really disturbingly little about the issues of racial hierarchies in the core lens of capitalism, although Marx certainly mentioned about the importance of the initial capital accumulation and the colonial dispossession in the process of initial capital accumulation. So, and here certainly racism is deeply related to this original sin of capitalist accumulation, which was done basically through dispossessing lots of non-white communities. So, but maybe this racialized capitalism may be also productively analyzed through the lens of vote system theory, to the degree the racial minorities inside the core of capitalist vote system in a way represent periphery in the core, represent the groups which territorially find themselves inside the core, but at the same time are being peripheralized in the way in which peripheries are also being marginalized in the hierarchical construction of world capitalism. Maybe it will help us to make a more inclusive definition of racial inequality, because, for example, in the place where I normally reside, in Norway, I think one of the biggest minority groups there, and very discriminated group, are actually Eastern Europeans, especially Poles and Lithuanians. Yeah. If you go to any construction site, you listen to Polish language there, which I bit understand. So to say, and there is obviously a huge amount of all sorts of discrimination vis-a-vis the Eastern European minorities there, but again, plainly visually, of course, they may be less distinguishable than racially more distinguishable minorities, while the nature of their othering, of course, it doesn't happen in the extreme forms which you find in the United States in relationship to the Black community. There are no police killings of Poles in Oslo. So to say, so of course, it's much, much less extreme. But if we think about the essential nature of discrimination here, that's probably to a degree similar. So what do you think about that?
Very interesting question that you raised. Thank you very much for that. That's a, now I want to make it clear, it's an excellent point that you're raising, because I want to make it clear that I'm not doing a, as you notice, my presentation is specific in terms of certainly its empirical content to the United States. So I'm not I'm certainly not intending to generalize from the United States experience the entire global context, because the experience of racism is very, very different in other places, or the extent or even presence of racism is a very different situation. And we can talk about other places in the world that are, you can talk about Han Chinese racism, right? We can talk about forms of racism against ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia, for instance, which had a lot to do with in Indonesia, the slaughter of the Indonesian Communist Party in 1965, which was largely consisted of ethnic Chinese. But I think we, as your comments suggest, we have to be careful because there are very differences. This is called for kind of a levels analysis, right? Yeah. The phenomenon of racism has different implications, different meanings in different places in the world. It's not a uniform process. And certainly what you're talking about in terms of Norway, we can also talk about Norway and the Sama peoples, right, in the north, and the discrimination against them. And of course, so it doesn't always take an explicitly color line, right? But the interesting thing is about how discrimination increasingly takes on the form. It's as if American anti-Black racism becomes the template for other forms of discrimination that are not really racial. And that should come as a surprise to us, because Fanon argues, I think the great conceptual divide opening that Fanon makes is sociogenesis, that race is not a biological issue at all. It's a complete social construction. Now, everybody talks about race as a social construction today, but they have a rather superficial understanding of it often. If you listen carefully, many people still view race as some kind of a biological or ontological category, which Fanon rejected. But the point is that even when anti-Black racism became so integral to the accumulation of capital, as you suggested, in not only its early origins, the primitive accumulation of capital, but successive centuries and decades of capital reproduction, that forms of discrimination, ethnically, religious-based, etc., take on the character of, or at least aspects of the character of what you see in the racism that permeates the Americas. So when I was, for instance, in Poland several years ago, and the outright racism against Ukrainian immigrants coming over the border, right? And people using imagery that was so characteristic of the American experience to people who look indistinguishable from each other. So there doesn't have to always be an epidermal dimension. But that's because it's a completely fabricated issue. Your point on world systems theory is well taken. I would just say, I would recommend a very fascinating book that has just came out, Planetary Mind by Martín Arboleda, who's a Chilean sociologist. Makes some interesting comments along these lines. I think today it's not so much, I don't subscribe to this notion of transnational capitalist class and that, nation states no longer are significant factors, secondary factors. But aside from not getting into that debate, what he shows, the good argument that he makes in this book is that the forms of value extraction today cannot be really adequately conceptualized today in terms of periphery and core. Because what we're seeing is it's domination by a global market, right? I mean, for instance, the example he gives is Chile. Is Chile periphery or core? Is China periphery or core now? How do we understand this? It's like a 20-fold increase in the amount of value in the mining sector of mining capital being exported to China in the last 15 years from Chile. Extraordinary increase. Which is the periphery and which is the core? Or is there instead an enveloped total world market that really is what's the hegemon here that we're talking about, that goes beyond the core versus periphery issue? But you're right in the sense that we have, between all these destabilizing factors of global capitalism, and especially ecological factors, right? The global warming and the disturbances from species depreciation and also rural to urban migration, et cetera, massive numbers of people who are migrating from the periphery, if we want to still use that term, to the core, and then finding themselves besieged by entrenched racial ideology. And this is why we can't have a 21st century Marxism that doesn't have racism at the center of its theoretical analysis.
Absolutely. Both racism and, of course, the environmental issues, because now it's not only accumulation at the cost of certain racially distinguished populations, it's also accumulation at the cost of our existence on this planet. So obviously, very obviously. Thank you very much for your answer. And now we have two questions in the chat window by Sonjin and by Chinyon. I will start reading Sonjin's question to you. Peter, thank you very much for the passionate and insightful talk. I think your Marxist analysis and alternatives to the racialized capitalism remarkably supplement the serious missing area or void in the existing Marxism. That is the relationship between race and capitalism and post-capitalism, especially Marxism in Korea, where the nation are allegedly composed of so-called single race. I learned very much from your talk. Question. As for the alternatives for racialized capitalism, you argued for the mutual aid as well as abolition of prison and police. I'm wondering that those demands will be the transitional demands in general too, rather specific to the racialized capitalism. What do you think of the separation and self-determination of the oppressed race? In existing Marxism, race equation has usually been approached as a national question, or more specifically a question of minority nations. Lenin argued for the separation of self-determination of the minority nationalities. It's a very important, famous point of contention between Lenin and Luxemburg, obviously. So what do you think about it?
Thank you. Great question. Okay, first, I think that I'll take the latter part of the question first and then back up to the earlier part of the question. In terms of the national question, self-determination, I think we have to remember in the Marxist tradition is understood in a multiple number of ways. Rosa Luxemburg opposed calls for national independence, and she opposed the slogan self-determination because she thought that the people advocating it implied national independence. Whether she was right or wrong about that's another question. I think she was wrong. But in any case, that's what she argued. But you don't have to, self-determination does not necessarily mean separation of the minority group from the larger society. It has been taken that way by significant strands of Marxism. For instance, in 1928, the American Communist Party adopted under great pressure Stalin's black belt thesis, right? That the liberation of African Americans could best be achieved as a transitional kind of program to socialism, of advocating for socialism, by having the southern states of the United States be controlled as a black homeland, as it were. This never had much support from black Americans, but it's an idea that's been out there since the Garvey movement in one form or another, and right up to the present, although it's a small minoritarian movement. The bulk of the struggles of African Americans in the United States has been struggles for self-determination, not to establish an independent nation or not to separate from the wider society, but to integrate into the wider society. Right? I mean, this is what Dr. Martin Luther King understood, even though he had his doubts at the end of his life of whether his approach of pushing for integration was, as he put it, asking people to enter a burning building. He realized that there were serious limitations in the effort to integrate into American society. And I think we have to keep that in mind, is that it's too narrow a lens, I think, to read struggles against racism today in terms of the debates at the beginning of the 20th century over self-determination, when the framework of that discussion was, do we support independent states or do we not support independent states? One more example of this. Self-determination could mean, obviously, if you say, I support the right of a given people to self-determination, that means that in principle, they have a right to form their own nation. Because if they don't, then what does it mean to be self-determined, right? But they can also exercise self-determination without wanting to have a separate nation. The Jewish Bund in Russia, for instance, the first nationwide Marxist organization of the Russian Empire was a Jewish organization, yes? And they did not want national independence, nor were they Zionists. What they wanted was cultural autonomy, and that's how they understood self-determination. You have a third variant of self-determination. A given people can decide to join an existing state, not to separate it from it. Some Jewish leftists in Israel, anti-Zionist Jewish leftists in Israel for many years have been arguing that the only hope for the Israeli working class is to accept the understanding that their self-determination is best secured by joining a secular Palestinian, democratic secular Palestinian state and ending the state of Israel as it's currently constituted. So there's many, many different variants of self-determination. And today, this kind of nationalist, the nation state context of the debate on self-determination is not does not pull on the new generation. The new generation knows, at least implicitly, that they're not going, I'm talking about Black activists that I know, people in the Latino community, there's an implicit understanding, look, we're a minority, we're not going to be able to ultimately change American society without a lot of allies, right? So it's trying to stir up the society to get those allies out, and that's what has happened in the last year without anybody planning for it. That's one of the beautiful things about these protests. Now, the broader question that was posed about transitional, whether these demands can be transitional, specific to racialized capitalism. Right. That would be a whole nother lecture, a whole nother talk about what is meant by the slogan defund police in these campaigns that have emerged from the protests of the last year, even though there were people advocating this for over a decade now. It doesn't mean everybody, it's misrepresented by many people. It doesn't mean people not saying, oh, we think it's like turning off a light switch. We want the police to be defunded tomorrow and no more police. That's not what they're saying. They're talking about defunding as a process of reorientating resources away from the militarized repressive vehicle of the state, and instead allocating resources being sucked up by that militarized vehicle, instead going into counseling, mental health facilities, community organizations that empower people, women's committees that can deal with issues of domestic violence. It's a transitional, it's a process to progressively reduce the amount of funding going to police and using that funding as well as much other funding to restructure social priorities. In Chicago, for instance, the campaign that I'm involved in, our demand was that the Chicago city budget back in November, we demanded that the mayor we demanded the city council reject her budget and instead demand that the police budget be cut by 75%. We didn't say 100%, we said 75%. We knew no chance of getting close to 75%. The idea was to put an idea out there as a vision of a possible movement forward. We didn't get that. The mayor instead increased the police budget. But almost half, 21 out of 50 of the Chicago City Council voted against her budget under this kind of popular pressure, which had never happened before. Mayors always get their way with the budget. So my point here is that when people call for defunding police, in the way it has been framed by movement activists, whether they're aware of it or not, it is implicitly challenging the fundamental essence of capitalism. Because you cannot have capitalism without policing. Because even if tomorrow the police disappeared, the public police disappeared, what the police don't protect communities, they protect property. They protect property rights. That's their main job. So the corporations would do, or the businesses would do, they would create privatized police forces, which, by the way, is the origin of the policing system in the United States. Policing emerges from private police like Pinkertons, etc., who were used to defend industrial capitalists against strikers. And then it was the course of this policing was socialized and made a government function, right? So people in the movement all know this, that in asking for defunding police, they know you can't get the complete defunding of police within capitalism. They're saying that when you ask for defunding police, it raises the necessity in people's mind, hey, wait a second, to get this, it requires such a transformation of social values, such a transvaluation of values that's so alien to American culture and social existence at the moment that it opens up all kinds of possibilities for future struggle. And so in this sense, look, we have to be honest. What revolutions of the 20th century abolished police? None of them, right? Which abolished the military? None of them. You can say there was a good reason they couldn't, but the point is they didn't. So when there's a call for not just defunding, but abolishing ultimately prisons, police, etc., that orientates people into the direction of thinking, hey, there is the entire social structure of society has to be uprooted, right? And we don't know how to do that yet. We don't know how do we get from here to there. There's no little group that can write a transitional program for socialist revolution that can explain how to do this. This is a discussion that's going on right now. And most of the people involved in these discussions are 18, 19, 20-year-olds, to be quite honest with you, right? Who don't know a lot of history or let alone philosophy. But the point is that it's raising the right kind of question.
Thank you very much for your answer. And now we have two people in the queue ask you questions. First one would be Chin Yon Chon with two questions. So I will recite one by one. The first one is this. Do you have anything to speak about discrimination in between oppressed races like African Americans and East Asians typically? I suggest that there is not simply a single statement with the ruling divide strategically by the ruling class in the US. So as far as I can understand, the question is whether the tensions between Black and East Asian communities in the US are related to the divide and rule tactics or strategies employed by the American ruling class or dominant white community.
Mhm.
So that was the first question. And the second question is here. What do you want to say about if anyone raises an issue like the capitalist racialized wage earned income doesn't explain all about between issues working class united in the US labor union workers, especially huge gap between African American workers along with white American workers dominated, capturing a union power and Asian union workers along with Latinx workers comparatively having a weak power in the US as a whole. So I guess here it's a question of the power inequalities involved in the union organizing in the United States, with unions having differentiated power along racial lines. So we have two questions here.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Well, this question about the friction, first of all, there is deep divisions within Black America to begin with. There are many Blacks living in the United States as there is a total population of Canada. So nobody would ever say that all Canadians are pretty much the same. African Americans are now pretty much the same. And in fact, the demands for defunding police and abolishing prisons and police has opened up a wedge within the Black Americans. There's more older, more conservative Black Americans who feel threatened by this because they're not looking to change society. They're looking to keep their status, and they're worried about high crime rates in certain Black communities, and they don't see how you would get to how defunding can address what they're interested in. And likewise, there are tensions and divisions between different ethnic groups in the United States, and that's of course been going on for a very, very, very long time. Even between, for instance, Blacks and Native Americans. Just recently, there is an effort to, without going into the whole history of this, there were a considerable number of Blacks who were black slaves during the period of slavery who escaped from slavery, but then they joined up with Native American tribes who then made them slaves, okay? And their descendants are now trying to claim membership in those tribes in order to gain the benefits, because the government now is recognizing certain reparations basically for Native Americans, not for Blacks. That is the indirect reparations. There's cash payments given to peoples of Native American communities because of the past repression. And some of the Native American groups say they don't want to recognize these Blacks as actually part of their community, even though they live within them for 100 years. So you have all kinds of divisions at different levels. And certainly between Blacks and East Asians. This was a very, very big issue in the early 90s, especially during the Los Angeles rebellion over the Rodney King beating, because many of the stores in South Central Los Angeles were run by Koreans or people from South Asia, right? It's a pattern in poor, impoverished Black communities. There's relatively few there's Black-owned businesses, but there's not as many as there are of immigrant-owned businesses, right? And the most immediate face of repression, aside from the police that very often they feel they experience, is being, having to deal with the economic inequities dealt out by merchants, right? Who are of a different ethnicity. So in 1992, there was outright violence between many of the Black protesters or people in the Los Angeles rebellion and these Korean store owners and whatnot. This has changed, right? This is another remarkable thing, because the racism against Asian immigrants and Asian citizens of the United States, which really was under the surface, but never really came up above the surface very much, but which was fanned by Trump, calling this the China virus, okay? The Wuhan virus, right? Explicit racist rhetoric against Asians, number of Asians being killed and beaten on the streets or assaulted, etc., in anti-Asian violence. The Black Lives Matter organizations, and there's many different ones, by the way, there's no one Black Lives Matter organization, but people associated with that general cause have formed a close solidarity with about trying to deepen their connections with the East Asian and Asian communities in many places in the United States, in solidarizing with them against this. So the atmosphere on that one has changed quite considerably. But I also have to mention, there's a lot of tensions between Latinos or Latinx and African Americans as well, because that too is not, Latinos are not an undifferentiated entity. Over at least 35% of Latino voters went for Trump in the last election, a higher percentage than previously. And a good number of them were working class Latino. This is not just, wealthy Cuban exiles in Miami. And there's a complex, that's a complex issue to unravel why that's happening. But at the same time, you have a lot of, from the very beginning of the groups fighting for police reform or prison abolition in places like New York, Chicago, Texas, etc., very firm alliances between immigrant rights groups representing Latinos and African Americans. But there are class divisions within these communities, and there are conflicts as well in terms of priorities. So we should not think of this as it's a concrete that is internally differentiated, to use the good Hegelian Marxian expression. Now, in terms of unions, I think the biggest challenge facing the unions today in terms of this issue of racism is police unions. What has really what's very clear is it doesn't matter in the United States who gets elected mayor, who gets elected governor, etc. In Chicago, for the first time, we have a Black woman lesbian mayor. I mean, I didn't think she was much, I didn't vote for her. But the point is, to a lot of people, oh, well, we're finally we're gonna get somebody representing maybe at least some of these disenfranchised communities. And she turned out to be just as bad as her predecessor, siding with the police and everything. Why is that? They can't do anything. The police unions negotiate these contracts that basically write into the contracts and makes it almost impossible for a police officer to be prosecuted for doing anything. The Minneapolis case was an exception to that. And only that happened when the chief of police, the police union was forced out, right? So they come into office and these contracts stipulate, not only paying the police an enormous amount, giving them these enormous pensions, they can retire after 25 years at almost full pay. And then they take a job somewhere else as a cop as well and make twice as much. I mean, not just the economic side of it, but all kinds of limits on disciplinary action against police officers who commit abuses. And then they're contractually bound. The new administration comes in and can't do a damn thing about it. And furthermore, of course, what happens all the time in the US is whenever there's a mass protest or so-called rioting breaks out against police abuse, especially in poor Black and Latinx communities, what the police do is they go on a slowdown. They're doing that in Chicago right now, where crime rates are spiking in the Black neighborhood. Why? Because they're not answering the 911 calls. They're sitting on their asses and they take an hour or two to return a call that previously they would try to deal with the situation in 15 minutes after getting notification of it. They're deliberately denying service to residents in the community, saying, well, if you don't like us anymore, you think we're all bad, well, we'll teach you a lesson. You'll have to deal with the crime on your own. They don't say that, of course, but that's what they're really doing with their actions. So unless you can break the power of the police unions, you can't really get effective police reform. And that is why many people inside the labor movement are arguing for the police unions and the prison guard unions to be expelled from the AFL-CIO, the main union confederation. The same union that represents school teachers, many school teachers ask me, is the same union that represents police officers and prison guards. They're in the same damn union. And they're adversaries. Police are not workers. They are gendarmes of capital. They are agents of capital. They should not be considered part of the labor movement. But it's very, very difficult to get them decertified, because if you can decertify a police union very easily, the bourgeois state will use that as a vehicle to decertify other unions that are not police unions. It'll just add to their strike rate, their union busting efforts. But breaking the power of the police unions, and this is an unresolved issue. This is something that is being discussed a lot. How do we get around this? How do we get around this problem? It is a very, very big one. I just leave it at that for now.
Thank you very much for your answer. It's interesting, actually, because in Norway, I am a member of the Union of State Servants. So teachers, professors, they are state servants. And actually, officers working at the prisons are members of the same union as me. So, so you know what I always get lots of reports about the working conditions at prisons and so on at our union bulletin. What is interesting is that Norway, of course, nobody would ever think about demanding to defund them or expel them from the union. It has something to do with long-term existence of a redistributional state, which to some degree made the consciousness of this sort of contradictions a bit numbered, maybe. But anyway, so we have here maybe a sort of problematic consciousness specific for the American conditions? I'm not sure.
Mhm.
Okay, so then we have a question by Hara Yara from Koblenz. And here's a question, it's multi-part question. On capitalist society, capitalist production being racialized. He writes, I want to involve Lukács. His Budapest Foundation has a 50th to the Stack Memorial talk on 17th June. Do you understand racialization of capitalist life as immediate or mediated or both? Did racialization precede human development in a capitalist form? And what do you see as a relationship between the racialization of humans and the ethnicization, also the nationalizing, the peopling? I draw here on Roger Brubacher's stress on processual analysis in his Transylvanian ethnographies. Finally, for the oppressed, isn't the problem racism, more precisely racialized oppression, not racialization, so ethnicizations? It's a very, very extensive question with lots of important problematic points. I will appreciate if also taking into consideration the limited nature of our time, if you could offer a short answer.
I'll be very brief on this, because it's not an important question, but because of the time factor. Okay, if you take seriously the notion that race is a social construction, then you have to be able to explain why was it socially constructed? What were the social conditions that made it possible for people to notice skin color as a decisive characteristic justifying the oppression of a given race of people? This is not a natural condition. So we don't see this in the ancient world. The Greeks and Romans had slavery, of course, but it wasn't race-based slavery. And by the way, people of color were not viewed as racially inferior to those who are lighter color in the ancient world, at least in the Western context. So if race is a social construction, one is compelled to ask, what are the social conditions that give rise to that phenomenon? I think that my view of this, very simply, is that it is the rise of the global market and through the transatlantic slave trade. That when Europeans exhausted their labor supply in the Americas through the extermination of Native Americans, and there was not a sufficient degree of European migration of labor in order to take advantage of the exploitation of the natural resources, and they needed an additional labor force, they turned to Africa, and they had to impose a much more brutal form of slavery and oppression than had ever been seen, probably, because you're pulling people out of their natural environment, transporting them thousands of miles across an open ocean, dropping them in a completely different environment and ecosystem, and then basically working them to death. As Marx says in Capital, the average slave initially lasted 7 years before they were worked to death, yes? How do you justify that without thinking in terms of now their skin color as signifying inferiority? And therefore you can justify to yourself treating people as not human because you don't view them as human, right? So I tie it to this transatlantic slave trade. I don't see evidence of anti-Black racism prior to the late 15th century. Even very few instances of it there. Even the term racism in Spanish, Italian, English, etc., doesn't exist until like 1485 or somewhere in that arena. So race had to be constructed. Now, there are people that argue, Cedric Robinson is one of them, wrote an important book, Black Marxism, and a lot of other people follow him on this, and I think completely in the wrong direction, that European anti-Black racism has its origins in feudalism. And they look at the ethnic conflicts between, different Magyars attacking Germans, Poles being attacked by Russians, Normans attacking, Anglo-Saxons, whatever, these ethnicized conflicts, and reading them as the origins of racialization. I don't think that holds water because you can't have anti-Black racism without the concept of Blackness. And the concept of Blackness does not exist in Europe. The concept of Black is not a natural concept. What Black signifies is the antithesis of white. You can't have whiteness as a category without its negative image of Blackness, and you can't have Blackness as a social category without its negative reference to whiteness. You don't see that in the Middle Ages. The Normans are not invading England in 1066 because they view the Anglo-Saxons as a different race. They're viewing them because they want to get their resources. They don't give a damn what race they were. And many of these so-called ethnicities were very mobile, we're finding out now. Magyars had Slavs in there, they had Germans mixed in. It's a very, very much more fluid sort of phenomenon that can't be pigeonholed into the later conceptualization of race. The reason that's an important debate to have is because what Cedric Robinson and people like him don't answer is, okay, so if feudalism is the origin of anti-Black racism, what social conditions explain its origin? And they never answer that question. They never even raise that question because there's no empirical vehicle by which to address it, which means they fall back into a biological vision or notion of race, that basically, white people act the way they do because they're white. But that doesn't make any sense because white people per se don't exist until the designation of Black as inferior exists. Whiteness is not a metaphysical category. It's a socially constructed arbitrary recent category.
I thank you very much for your brief answer. And now Yara asks, now we have another question from Yara. I would put it before the next series of questions, and I guess it will have to be the last one from Mia Son. So the question from Yara, next question from Yara is here. Thanks, Peter, for your talk and addressing the questions. Another one on the relationship between growing a single issue movement and trying to develop a socialist, communist, anti-capitalist party, so-called movementism versus partyism. Black Lives Matter is significant, but so were the many mobilizations in South Korea from the mid-1980s. Without parties growing out of mobilizations, acting as a collective organizer and collective memory, won't movements lose momentum and die? Aren't parties necessary to make gains more likely to last? Thanks again for today's session. So again, it's a huge question. One can write perhaps monographs on the importance of vanguard party and whether this vanguard party thing is still relevant to us. So, but I would like to ask you to offer a brief answer.
Well, yes. First of all, I wouldn't say that the movement for Black Lives is a single issue movement. I think it maybe earlier iterations of anti-racist movements or movements against ethnic discrimination could be considered single issue, but I don't see that today. I see it as a raising issues that are multiple in their intersectionality, which is a big issue in the American political vocabulary today, intersectionality. In other words, give you an example, there was one of the early 7 years ago, an organization was founded by young Black people to fight police abuse. They were young, they were in their teens or 20s, and they called it Black Youth Project 100. And when they formed their organization, they said they were going to be committed. They defined their organization by looking at American society from a Black, feminist, queer lens. So they define themselves in terms of three substantive social issues: race, gender, sexuality. That's kind of typical of this generation. So it's not really a single issue. Like, that's why I mentioned in my early part of my talk, the protests were not discussing just police abuse. They were not just discussing racism. There was all kinds, it became like, at their highest moment, they became almost like public forums of discussion of an array of issues. They would pass the microphone around in the crowd, get up and talk about what brought you here, what problems do you have with this country? And people would talk about an array of different issues that would come up. So in that sense, it's I think the focus on racism, because it's the Achilles heel of American civilization, it opens up a discussion of many issues rather than closing them down. The more substantive part of your question, of course, is movementism versus partyism. Well, I mean, there's a long history of trying to build vanguard parties or political parties in general in the United States. There's been 80 years at least of these efforts, and they've been pitiful. There's never been a significant Marxist party that has any mass support in the history of the United States. A little glimmer was the Socialist Party right before World War I, when it was significant, had 100,000 members. Its president actually got 1 million votes when he was running from jail, Eugene Debs. That was broken up, soon declined and broke up. And then, of course, the Communist Party, but after the 1940s, it was an insignificant force for the most part. It did have about 100,000 members also at the eve of World War II. But there's never been a really successful application of Leninist party principles to the United States. And I think for a very simple reason. Leninist party principles were developed in the context of societies that did not have bourgeois democratic that did not experience the bourgeois revolution. In other words, they were not bourgeois democratic republics. And a Leninist theory of organization, if it has relevance, it has relevance to those living under conditions of absolutism. But Lenin never intended, I don't think, for it to be a universal theory of organization, and it doesn't work. I mean, this is what I think Gramsci was coming to understand as well, with this theory of hegemony, right? That you need a different adaptive strategy for bourgeois democracy. Now, today in the United States, there is an organization that is almost as large as the Socialist Party and the Communist Party were at their peaks many, many years ago. That's the Democratic Socialists of America. It was an organization that was not a very interesting one. It was a kind of a moderate social democratic organization with maybe 3,000 members, and as of 7 years ago, and almost all of them were inactive. Wasn't a very active or interesting group, but because of the Bernie Sanders campaign, they now have 80,000 members, and all kinds of Marxists of every stripe, anarchists, Marxists, Maoists, Trotskyists, Marxist humanists, you can mention them, are all in there. It's not a party though. It's a loose federation. It doesn't take really positions on particular political questions outside of, what we might call movement issues, right? But the one reason why that non-party kind of grand coalition does seem to have gotten traction is that the more sectarian Marxist parties have all fallen apart. Several of them, at least two, maybe three of them have fallen apart because of sex scandals, right? Sexual abuse scandals inside their organizations. I mean, I think that there's a role, obviously, for parties. And right now, DSA works within the Democratic Party. It sees itself as a left pressure group trying to push the Democratic Party as far to the left as possible. And there are people in DSA, maybe close to half of the membership, that would like to form a new independent third party to contest an alternative to the Democrats and the Republicans. And that'll eventually probably have to happen because Biden is now already making too many compromises. But the point is that the American electoral system does not give many options. It's not a parliamentary system. It's a winner-take-all system. And it's extremely difficult. On the local level, you can win seats. In Chicago, there are 6 socialist city council members. We've never had that before. Since the last time we had more than a handful of socialists sitting on the Chicago City Council was like 1911. That was the last time, literally 100 years ago. Now we have 6 out of 50, and that's good. I'm not saying they're revolutionary Marxists, they're democratic socialists, but still, that's better than what we had. But the point is that it's very, very difficult to compete in a two-party system with the millions and billions of dollars that it takes to run on the national level. And look, what we saw with the Bernie Sanders campaign, the mainstream Democrats made sure, and they were going to make sure, that Bernie Sanders was not going to get that nomination. He was headed to get the nomination. They pulled the rug out from under him. They would have supported Trump re-election before they would allow Bernie Sanders to take over the Democratic Party. So there probably will be some sort of split at a certain point, and there may be new party configurations that emerge. But I would have to say that in the American context, parties, especially including vanguard parties, so-called vanguard parties, tend to be as ephemeral as movements. In a sense, the movements are more longer lasting than the parties.
Yeah, so here we obviously have differences again with European experiences. In Norway, the moderate Social Democratic Workers' Party is one of the oldest parties. It started in 1887. So, and well, it's obviously has been continuing and has played a role as sort of organizing, basically a sort of state building force, in addition to being a redistribution mechanism, sort of part of the redistribution mechanism. So obviously American realities are very different. And
yeah, I just noticed in the chat that Yara thinks I may have misconstrued the second part of her question. If I did, I would want to, be able to hear what she thinks about this and clarify better, give a better response if I misunderstood her point on the second half of the question about parties and movements.
Yes, and now I guess the last question we are going to have are from Mia Son, and we have 2 questions basically here. Just a minute. Yes, here we are. I read it. I agree with your opinion that new kinds of multiracial working class struggles emerge. The question number one. Then Marx's main idea that the workers in the large industries as the main core body for the revolution can be a bit changed or developed. In fact, some activists among the working class still think that the workers in the large industries are the main body for the workers' movement. For example, the KCTU, Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, don't consider the minority of different industries of workers, but still focused on the workers in the large factories. And the second one, battles over the race, gender, and sexuality are important, I think so, but there seems no interaction between the workers in the large industries and women in the feminist movement. For example, the idea of Marxist and the idea of feminist are different. For example, the feminists think that the origin of main contradiction of the society is a conflict between men and women, and the activists against racism can think that the main origin is a conflict between, I guess it was meant race, between races. I think it probably ideas here are a bit more complicated. It's not conflict between races, but race being used as a social construct for certain purposes. So we have, and the last one, how do you think, is it related the movement against racism and sexual discrimination to the Marx idea of revolutions by working classes main body? Thank you very much for the questions. I guess it probably will have to be the last series of questions. And again, it's a very huge topic, how you interlink the feminist movements, the movements against racial injustice, and the struggles by the workers, especially those employed at large industries organized by large unions. So if you could offer a very brief answer to this.
Yes. Well, first of all, I want to say that I've never believed that Marxism is reducible to a theory of class struggle, although I've always believed and still do that class struggle is central to Marxist theory. I believe that Marx, of course, and Marxists have to focus on those social struggles that are most likely to seriously challenge the capitalist mode of production. And for that, you can't escape the question of class and class struggle, and the working class, especially the industrial working class. That remains a pivotal element within any emancipatory project. But one has to develop one's understanding of what Marxism means for today based on the actual forces that are in front of us and the changes in the nature of the working class that we're seeing unfolding. Now, I'm not trying to write a universal theory here. So I can't speak for situations in South Korea or the rest of the world, but I can speak for the situation in the United States and say the following is that there is a recomposition of the working class. It's a myth that the United States is, of course, no longer an industrial power. It remains an industrial power. That's why it's in conflict with China, right? Increasingly, because the International Division of Labor gives the United States the industrial manufacturing capacity to produce the high-end computer chips, artificial intelligence, et cetera, and then outsourcing to low-wage areas in the global South, the more labor-intensive industries that are less profitable. That is what has been the secret or the tragedy of the American society over the last 40 years. This has recomposed the working class in the United States. So we're still a major industrial power, but with an incredibly smaller percentage of people employed in industrial labor because of so much automation and so much computerization. Now, so that reconfigures the nature of the class struggle, okay? And what that's reflected in is we have some very powerful unions and some very interesting work in the labor movement that's been done the last several years. It's primarily, however, within public sector unions, like teachers' unions. And they have made some really important progress in challenging the direction of the effort to privatize education and corporatize education in America. And this is an ongoing battle that I'm personally involved in as well, in my own institution. But I'm a member of the executive board of my union. But the point I'm trying to get at here is that given the structure of American society, the adequate confrontation with the class issue has got to always be through the race issue. It doesn't mean that race replaces class, but since racism is what structures the class relations of our society, we can't adequately deal with the problem of class in a context such as this without making the question of race foremost. Dunayevskaya has a phrase, a Marxist humanist philosopher who I worked with for many years, black masses as vanguard of any potential American revolution. I think that holds up very much for today. And that's why I'm trying to speak in my own presentation about an intersectional Marxism that is not on the level of neoliberalism or bourgeois liberalism kind of intersectionality that excludes the class struggle. You get a lot of that, especially in American academia, but an intersectional Marxism. We need an intersectional Marxism. Marx himself said in 1844 that the man-woman relationship is the most fundamental in society and the measure of whether a society is making progress or not. He could have said the class struggle is the most fundamental relation and the measure of a society, but he didn't say that. And I think he didn't say that, and he did say it's the man-woman relation, the gender relation that's pivotal, because I think he focused on class struggle because of the role of class in fighting class domination is inseparable from fighting the dehumanization that defines the form of social practice of capitalism. And any form of dehumanized interpersonal relationships is the target of his critique. It has to be the target of any genuine Marxist critique. That's what I mean by a humanist Marxism. Once we phrase these issues or frame these issues in a humanist Marxist context, then it doesn't become any more race versus class or race versus gender. It becomes whether we're opposing forms of dehumanized interpersonal relationships or whether we're not. And whether we're keeping our fingers on the pulse of human relations and focusing on their transformation, or whether we're just talking about abstract structures that we talk about changing, but never actually have a political strategy to actually address change. So that's probably an incomplete answer, definitely an incomplete answer to your very, very good point. But I would just open it up to that viewing Marxism as a theory of class struggle is no longer sufficient. That doesn't mean throwing out the class struggle. It means that from the beginning, it should have been viewed as a theory of liberation. Marxism is a philosophy of liberation, or it is nothing.
Thank you very much for your answer. And again, we have good historical background for this. If you look at the lived experience of Russia's October Revolution, industrial proletariat of Petrograd was, of course, indisposable to that, but so also were various minorities. In the Red Army, there were tens of thousands of ethnic Chinese, ethnic Koreans, around 5,000 ethnic Koreans being also fighting there as partisans and regular troops. Thousands of Latvians, for example. Latvians were especially important for Red Army's victories. They were considered the most reliable among all the Red Army troops, and so on and so on. So October Revolution was as much a minority revolution as it was a revolution by large factory-based industrial proletariat. So certainly all this is not necessarily historically new, although again in the United States, you have a very special condition, a society based on white settlers taking away the land from the local population and then using black people as chattel commodity for the sake of capital accumulation. So very specific historical experience. So thank you very much for wonderful presentation, very interesting, very thought-provoking. So great thanks to everybody who had been with us. And I hope that you will continue to patronize the other lectures in our series. So I wonder if the organizers would like to say something before we end.
Oh.
Sonjin, would you like to say something?
Yeah. Oh, no.
No.
Very,
Okay.
Yeah, very rich. Yeah. Presentations and discussions.
Yeah. So thanks to everybody who had been present. Thank you, Peter, once again, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
And you can all contact me at my email if you wish to correspond. I'm a very good correspondent. So look forward to hearing from you. But I'll be back at the meeting.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.